This episode we're going to be talking about the data types of React and TypeScript. Some of the stuff talked about in this episode will seem quite straightforward and will come naturally, whereas other bits might take some more time to get your head around because there's a slight learning curve here. So to get started, we're going to delete some stuff. Now if you were following last episode, your screen should look the same as mine. But if you didn't and it doesn't, don't worry because we're going to change it up. What I'm going to start by doing is deleting all the children of app, and then also get rid of the app class name. So we're just left with this div. And we'll add a new line to make space. So if we save that and go to our web page, it should be completely blank. Good. Now we're going to want to make some space between app and return to give us some room to work with. The first thing that we're going to talk about is called a const. Now const stands for constant, which means it doesn't change. Constants hold values for us that we can use within our web page. So if I show you what it looks like, we type out const, enter a space. Now you can give it a name, and that can be whatever you want. My first const, it all has to be one word. Now we can assign this const a value by pressing space, equals space, and let's do hello in quotations. Again, remember that you have to finish your lines with a semicolon. So what we've got here is a constant called myFirstConst, and it has a value of the word hello. We can see what this looks like within our web page if we put it between the divs. And to put a const in your HTML, you want to put in some curly brackets and then enter the name of the const. If we save this, we should see hello on our web page. And there it is tucked away in the corner. This episode we're not going to bother with any stylings to make it look fancy, we're just going to get the information out there. So this const doesn't have to be a word. My first const could be a number. If we save this, we should see the number 1 on the screen now. Our next variable declaration is called a let. Let is similar to const in that it holds a value, but the difference here is that let can be changed, whereas const can't. So if we give this let a name of my first let, and we'll make that equal 1. If we change the contents here to my first let instead of my first const, we should see 1. Which obviously is no difference from our first one, except for here we can now say my first let equals 2. It should, before it reaches the return, it should now be 2, therefore we should show the number 2. So if we try to do the same thing with the constant, it should complain. And so we get this big red squiggly line which tells us that something's gone wrong. And there's your message that I cannot assign to my first const because it is a constant. So now we know how to declare a const and a let, we can talk about the types of them. And this is where TypeScript comes into play. If we look at my first const, you can probably guess what the type is. It's a number. We can assign a type to something by adding the colon after the name and then adding your data type. So typing out number in this case. So now this will read, a constant called myFirstConst is a type number and is equal to 1. What this is doing is securing the type of the const. This means that myFirstConst now has to be a number. So if we were to change it to something else, like we had before, it will complain. So we can see here 2 error messages. The first one being myFirstConst is declared but it's never read. So we can fix that by taking it and putting it down here. So now it's used, it shouldn't complain about that anymore. Which leaves us with the type error, which says type string is not assignable to type number. So now you might be asking, what's a string? A string is essentially anything that's in quotation marks. It's usually used for words and sentences. So if we change this type to string, it will stop complaining. This typing comes in really handy for us when we're doing stuff like lets, because this will make sure, if we give it a type of number, that it will never change from number So if we reassign my first let to a string later on, it will complain. So another type that you can assign to constants is Boolean. You might not be familiar with what a Boolean is, but it just means yes or no, true or false. So true is valid and false is valid, but nothing else will be. Another data type that we have is a date. So you'd imagine that a date would look like this. But no, it doesn't. That's still a string. To make a date, we're going to have to write new date. Now you can insert that string inside the parentheses of the new date, and this will now create a date for us. Dates are functional data types, so if you save this and go to your web page, we're not going to be able to see anything right now. For us to make this visible, we're going to have to go to the end of my first const here in between the divs and do dot to string like this with the open close parentheses. If we save that, you should now be able to see what that date looks like in written format. We've got day, month, date, year, time with hours, minutes, seconds, time zone, and then the written time zone. And the reason that it was GMT is because my computer is on GMT and it uses your computer to calculate the time zone. I don't want to dive too much into dates because they are quite complicated and it's too advanced for where we're at right now. So the data type that we're going to end on is undefined. So undefined means nothing or empty or not assigned yet. It can come in really handy for things like let. So if we don't know what we want it to be yet, it can be undefined. But at some point, obviously, we're going to want it to be something, which leads us into the next thing, which is the OR operator. So the OR operator does what it says. It lets it be one thing or another. So that OR operator is defined by a pipe, which is the line icon. So if we call this undefined or number, my first let can be undefined or a number. Now at first it will be undefined because we're not assigning it anything. And then here we will be assigning it a number. You can use that OR operator to add unlimited amounts of types. Now this is starting to look like another type that we can use called any. Now any is anything. It can be a Boolean, it could be a string, it could be an object, it could be a function, it could be whatever. Any is basically saying, I don't care. So the last thing we're going to look at in this episode is called an object. Now that can be a const again. My first object. This time the value is going to start with opening and closing curly brackets. So now we can give this object some values. Like so, but instead of an equals in here, we're going to use a colon. So that's what it looks like. So the object here is almost a container for all of its values. And it's a way for us to be able to store lots of similar information in one place. As you just saw there, each value has to end with a semicolon, so there's slight differences between a normal const and an object, like the colon here and the comma rather than the semicolon and an equals. And you can see that each value within the object can have a separate type. So we've got a string and a number. And if we wanted to see these values on the web page, we can grab my first object, copy that, paste it down here, and then do dot, and VS Code should automatically fill out our options for us. If we want the hello, we'll go for my first object value. If we save that, we should now see that on the web page. I can appreciate that the object is a bit different. It might be a little bit confusing or maybe off-putting. Just think of it as a container for values for now, and if you followed this far, you're getting all that you need out of it right now anyway. So if we wanted to get TypeScript involved with this object, we can type it similar to what we have done up here. So you might already know that my first object value is a string, my second object value is a number, and my third object value is a Boolean. And if we hover over the name of the object here, TypeScript will tell us that it also knows that. If you try and copy this, we can assign it to the object. Now the type is no longer being inferred because we've set the type. Now this means that we can't change my first object value because my first object value is a string. This also means that we can't add any more values. So here you can see the red squiggly line meaning it's complaining and it won't work. This is because we've typed the object to just be these three things. Now if we added to this type the fourth object value, it should stop complaining. So now you've had your first look at TypeScript, and this is essentially all there is to it. So in the next episode we're going to talk about something called arrays. Arrays are also a data type, but I feel like they were too complicated to squeeze into this episode. And it would be best for you to get to grips with all the stuff that I've shown you here first before moving on to something as complicated as arrays.